Welcome to Unlapped. We're back ahead of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Plus, we have significant news from Aston Martin. I think you already know if you listened to last week's episode of Unlapped, but it's officially official. Remember, if you're watching us on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review. We much appreciate it. All right, we're recording this on a Tuesday afternoon. Laz, you were just in Silverstone for the official announcement of Adrian Newey joining Aston Martin. What was the scene? Set the stage for us.
So it was at their brand new Spangly factory, and we're in building 2, which only opened last week. And it felt like a car launch. I mean, that's kind of what I'd compare it to. Usually, when engineers move from team to team, even drivers, the most we'll get is a press release with 2 sets of quotes, one from the team boss or team owner, one from the engineer or the driver, whoever's moved position. But with Adrian Newey, it was quite different. All the media turned up. We were treated to breakfast and coffee. I arrived a bit late for that because I came from London on the motorbike. But then we were shepherded down a good 20 minutes before to make sure that the media were all in place and not causing any trouble before Laurence Stroll entered the stage and announced that Adrian Newey had joined Aston Martin, not just as a very very well paid employee, but also as a shareholder within the team, which is also something I guess we can talk about a bit, but quite different to the usual engineering deals that go on. So yeah, it was a really big deal, but this is a big deal. You know, Adrian Newey is at least in part, I would say, very responsible for a lot of the success of Red Bull since he moved there in 2006. Of course, they had that period 2010 to 2013 where they won 4 titles, and they're having this period now where they're winning titles. And no matter who you talk to, I mean, a lot of people will say it's about the team. There's lots of people involved, and that is true. It is absolutely about all the individuals involved, and you know, one person cannot turn around a team by themselves. But Adrian Newey's genius, and I don't think it's exaggerating using that word genius from an engineering point of view, does bring something extra special to a team. And that's what Aston Martin definitely need right now. And that's what they're going to have from March the 2nd next year going forward in Adrian Newey.
I'm curious because his role has evolved and changed over time at Red Bull through the years. What exactly is his role day to day going to be, Nate, with Aston Martin moving forward?
Yes, it's a pretty wide-ranging role. I think the official title is managing technical partner, and I'm not sure, I might be wrong on this, Laurence, but I haven't heard that job title before in Formula One. And I mean, that speaks to a few things. First of all, it speaks to the fact that this is really the highest of management roles there. He's got a bunch of people working underneath him. One of the guys is Dan Fallows, who moved over from Red Bull a few years ago. You know, there's a bunch of, you know, and you can say quote unquote big name engineers because I don't know how many people actually know a lot of them. But in the world of Formula One, they're a really big deal. And Laurence Stroll has been slowly cultivating this team. And what you've got with Adrian is you've effectively, if you want to look at it, is he is the cherry on top of what is already a really, really expensive investment in talent on that side of the Formula One operation, on the car building side. And yeah, it's very much him overseeing everything. I mean, they made a big point in the announcement that his role is really to spearhead the 2026 car. There's obviously new regulations, mainly focused around the engine, but the car obviously plays a huge role in that. And yeah, I think his main role is really going to be corralling that talent that's already there. And you know, you can read, there's a great piece Andrew Benson wrote on the BBC this week about this kind of the fabled talent of Adrian Newey. Actually, fabled is the wrong word because it isn't fabled. He has, the proof is in the pudding, but this idea that it's kind of become a bit of a myth that he's somehow able to see the air that flows over the car when he looks at a car, you know, in a way that other people just can't do it. You know, there's this mythical quality that Newey brings. And by all accounts, I mean, you know, Laurence can speak to it being there, but it sounded like all of the employees at Aston were out, you know, kind of welcoming Newey there. I was actually kind of surprised Red Bull allowed that to happen because, you know, contractually that I don't think they were obligated to have to do that. But yeah, I think it's so his role is like senior management. But yeah, it's one of those things that I think for Laurence Stroll, he mentioned it a bunch of times on the press conference that that's the biggest announcement that building has had so far, and he said at one point it's the biggest announcement we will have in this building, which really speaks to the fact that this isn't just signing a talent like Laurence said, it is signing the guy that Laurence Stroll and I think a lot of people in Formula One think will take Aston Martin from being the team that we say they're very ambitious, they want to win the championship too. Fernando Alonso put it perfectly, the team of the future. Him being there is a game changer, complete game changer, changes the whole temperature around the team. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how that actually plays out because we haven't seen that kind of role before. But if you're going to give anyone that role in Formula One, you don't even bat an eyelid that it's Newey. If it was other people, you might say, oh, that's a lot of money for a guy like that. But Newey, you don't even question it. And some of the numbers are pretty eye-watering. I mean, £30 million a year. I'm not sure the exact conversion over to dollars there, Katie, but it's a lot of money. And whether that's exactly accurate or not, we know Laurence Stroll hasn't been shy and kind of opening up the purse strings and just kind of throwing money at people. And yeah, that seems to have been the big difference for Newey going to Aston to anywhere else like Ferrari.
Yeah, I thought is it a 4 or 5 year deal? And when I read it, I thought, oh, like 30 something $million, like 5-6 million a year, like that sounds like a sports contract. Oh no, that's what he's making. He's making like 35 million annually a year.
Yeah,
So
it's
talk about
mad.
mad.
There's like bonuses
and
and stuff and the shareholding that Laurence mentioned. But yeah, it's the sort of thing you would pay a kind of tier 2 driver to come and work for you. I don't know
But
if
you
there's
pay
ever
the
been
best NBA players in the league to come play for your franchise team. Like, I mean,
yeah, right. Is it in the same ballpark? I guess it is. Yeah.
yeah,
Like
yeah. I mean,
I need to look at what
NFL,
Dak Prescott
NBA.
made the other day, but he's probably like, I wish I was an F1 engineer instead of a quarterback
No,
for the
I
Cowboys.
think he's doing just fine.
Yeah, he's done all right.
Yeah. I think it's important for us to mention because I don't know if, listeners, viewers, fans like realize just how far these teams work ahead in the design of their cars and for, the impending regulations that are going to change in 2026 LAS. So how much say is Newey now that when he joins, right, Aston Martin, how much say is he going to have in the design and in 2026 in particular when the regulations do in fact change?
Yes, that's a really important point. He doesn't start until March 2nd, and that's because he got his way out of the Red Bull contract he was on early, and the earliest they could do was March 2nd. And he was allowed to do this press conference, as Nate said, which is fine, but he's actually now going to go off on holiday. He's got about a week before he goes off on holiday with his wife and really makes the most of this final period where he's not tied down to a team. And he also said how at Red Bull, he was working on different projects, one of which is this RB17 supercar that was launched at Goodwood earlier this year, and how it seemed like he wanted stuff outside of F1 to work on. Now he's moving to Aston Martin. He said 100% of his time is going to be dedicated to Formula One because when you're moving into a new team like that, you can't afford for it to be any less. It's not like he's been there as part of the furniture for nearly 20 years as he was at Red Bull. He's coming in and he's will look to restructure certain things. I'm sure have some very clear ideas on what needs to be done to turn that into a championship winning team. Because right now it's a long way off that. They had the spell at the start of last year where they looked good, but now not so good. But in terms of 2026, well, that's the next big regulation change. And Laurence Stroll talked about how that's what they're targeting. 2025, obviously they want to make a step forward and they want to do as best as they can. But 26 is a big opportunity because that's when the rules change. It's when they also get Honda engines in the back of their car, a works deal with Honda. So at the moment they've got Mercedes customer engines and they also use the Mercedes wind tunnel as part of this broader deal with Mercedes. All that will go from 26. And you're allowed to start work on the 26 aero regulations. So the engines are already been developed for quite some time now, but the aero regulations you're allowed to start from January 1st next year. So that first 3 months or so, or a couple of months, Adrian won't be directly involved in the car for 26, but as soon as he gets there, he's going to come in with a bunch of ideas. And I think there'll still be a period in which he's able to set the direction on that car, and make sure it's where he wants it. Also, at the start of next year is when they're hoping to get this new wind tunnel online. And while Newey didn't really kind of talk too much about the new factory other than saying it looks very expensive and everything is in its right place and as it should be, I think that must have been a bit of a draw because apparently this wind tunnel is absolutely state of the art. It's got things that other F1 teams don't have. And if you are going into a new project like that, and this is what Newey did say, is it's that commitment from Laurence Stroll, from the owners, to say, look, we're going to invest in every little thing we can to make sure that you've got everything you need to do it. And it seems like Adrian Newey is the last piece of that jigsaw to slot into place and then to start directing all of those resources in the right direction. And so, yeah, that's where they stand. I think to be competitive in 2026 will still be a huge challenge for that team, just because, where they're coming from previously, the new relationship with Honda. Honda had a little bit of a break from the development of these engines when it looked like they were going to leave the sport. Then they came back. I think there's a few things where you're like, well, when you're up against the likes of Mercedes with their own engines, Ferrari, Red Bull, of course, are also doing their own engine project after 26. Yeah, it's going to be tough. It's not going to be that they're guaranteed victories when they get to 2026, but they won't have any excuses from that point onwards. They'll have everything in place, and it will be just a matter of kind of making that all work. And if Adrian can't do that, I don't know who can.
I just want to go back to something you said, that Laurence Stroll is willing to invest in every little single detail to ensure success. I don't want to crush a man by any means, because I do think he's talented, but the elephant in the room, and I think this is fair, and Nate, I definitely know how you feel about this. So Laz, I want your thoughts on this too. If you have a two-time world champion in Fernando Alonso, yes, you've invested in a great driver. You've brought Adrian Newey over for a boatload of money annually. You've created an unbelievable engineering team to support Adrian Newey in this new endeavor. I think it's fair to ask, the biggest drawback, or I guess the weakest link of this team from the outside looking in, is Laurence Stroll's son, Lance Stroll. Is that fair to say, if you're going to invest all this money to try to be successful, to try to win championships, when do you look in the mirror and assess if your son really is the best second driver for the team to succeed?
Well, the thing is, it's Laurence Stroll's project, so he can basically do as he wants.
Fair.
And, whether we like it or not, or where you rate Lance, it's his decision. And so far, he's shown absolutely no sign of getting rid of his son. And I don't think he will, as long as both he and Lance feel that, Lance should be in Formula One, wants to be in Formula One. I see the point there, but we've seen this year some signs that occasionally Lance, can perform. I think the thing that's always been slightly frustrating with Lance Stroll is that there is talent there, but it doesn't feel like he's always absolutely doing everything he can to access it and to make sure that he's making the absolute most of it. Whether that will change when they're in a position where they're challenging for races, maybe. Do I think he's as good as Fernando Alonso? No. And he's shown absolutely no sign since Alonso has joined the team that he is. But we've also seen other teams, occasionally it's not so bad to have a clear number one driver and a clear number two. McLaren right now, one of the things they're dealing with, and with Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, and whether Piastri should be backing Norris to go for the championship, is that, while I'm sure they would like to do that in an ideal world, they don't want to upset Piastri too much down the line in case, Piastri is the one that is either looking to other teams to leave or actually becomes their main challenger of championships in the future. So I don't think it's an impossible situation for Lance Stroll to continue at the team, even if he's, not performing at the level that other drivers could perform at. I think it's still possible for that to happen. And honestly, I think, I talked to Laurence Stroll in Las Vegas last year, did a very brief interview with him. And when you talk to him, he is absolutely convinced that his son deserves a place in Formula One. He has a long list of reasons why his son hadn't performed up to that point in the season. You can pick holes in some of it, but some of it, is based in truth. And then, he has this belief that that it will come good. So I think as long as Laurence Stroll is thinking that, it doesn't matter what the rest of us think, Lance is staying in that seat. And the only other thing, of course, is if Lance himself decides, actually, you know what, I've been up against the very best in Fernando Alonso, and I've decided that, maybe I want to go and do something different with my life. But right now, as unenthusiastic as Lance often sounds when he's talking about Formula One, he's also shown no signs that he's going to do that. And actually this year, he said that, he reflected on where he was in his career and he wanted to continue with Aston Martin. So there you go. Nate, over to you for a probably slightly more cutting response.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was a very fair assessment. I've been told by people that are in the know, people around, people who know the Strolls, that they said hell would freeze over before Laurence dropped Lance. And I think this year you saw a fairly good, a minor example of that. You had a driver like Carlos Sainz available, And we're always led to believe, well, Lance Stroll's just on this endless contract. They still made a song and dance this year of saying, we're delighted to announce that Lance Stroll has signed a 1 year deal. And I was kind of like, guys, like, he hasn't signed a 1 year deal. Like, his dad owns the team. He's fine. Like, it wasn't like he was like, oh, I've got to sign this. I assume he has to, legally there is a contract
Sure.
in place. I think Laurence makes a really interesting point there about, you've got to find that line, haven't you, between, do you want to be in a situation where you have two great drivers and you're in the situation McLaren is in, or a situation where you have a clear lead and maybe a much less good second. You can look at Red Bull as a counter of why you wouldn't want a very underperforming second driver if you're in a tight constructors fight. And I think the father son thing makes it complicated too, because how are Aston going to play team order situations? If Lance is out in front, it's his first win on the table, but actually, behind him, Fernando's there, and so, well, actually, we could do these 7 points for Fernando. It just, and there is, regardless of what Aston Martin tell you, they are completely on eggshells all the time when they're dealing with Lance. No one wants to criticize him. No one wants to suggest anything other than he is the greatest driver, that they've ever seen type thing. I remember being in Qatar last year when he pushed his trainer over and they said, no, it was just a friendly little shove on the, and it wasn't, and he was angry. Like, he got out of the car. It was super, super hot. I've never been in that situation, so can't throw stones completely. But the way they reacted to it at Aston Martin was not, it didn't correlate with what the driver had done. And you could tell there's just no way anyone on that team is ever going to put their neck on the line and say anything other than Lance Stroll deserves to be there. So I think, to be honest with you, part of me hopes that Lawrence Stroll does continue with him, purely because everybody else can see it's the one part of the team where he hasn't stuck to his guns of, I want the absolute best in every part of this car. I think Fernando ticks that box. Whether we see Laurence Stroll going after Max Verstappen, I think that's probably the next part of this narrative. You've got Newey from Red Bull. We know that Max Verstappen's kind of on the fence a little bit. I mean, Fernando Alonso's 43 years old now, so realistically speaking, unless they have a title contender and immediately out of the gate, and I agree with Laurence, I think it's harder to see that happening. Then you're going to have to think about who the next superstar driver is, unless he thinks it's Lance, unless he's just like, right, we'll get Lance in and we'll find, we'll put Logan Sargent in with him or something like that. But that defeats the point. It undoes all the good investment you've put in there. So, yeah, I do struggle with it as well, because I do wonder whether Lance Stroll would actually thrive in a situation where he wasn't so closely affiliated with his dad. Every single time he's been in Formula One, when it was with Williams, his dad was there. They drove people at Williams absolutely crazy. It was similar to the Mazepin situation. Stroll had a bad day. There were a million reasons. It was like, this was wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong. The answer was never, Lance just didn't perform today. And obviously now, he's driving for his dad's team. And, his dad was involved with Racing Point, different ways before that came to be. So it is interesting to wonder what would happen if Stroll just went it alone. I don't think we'll ever see that. I'm in the same boat as Laurence. But yeah, he definitely, he's taking a really, really good seat. I mean, look at next year. You've got Carlos Sainz at Williams. You've got Alex Albon at Williams. I think both of those guys are better drivers than Lance Stroll straight out of the gate. You've got Gasly, kind of lost to Alpine. He's better than Stroll. You could put him in there, but it does depend what kind of team you want to build. But in terms of is he the best second driver you can get there? Absolutely not. And if his surname wasn't Stroll, he wouldn't be in the car.
Well, I think it's interesting because they haven't been a good enough team for Lawrence Stroll to have to make a hard decision yet. Like, if they put together a car in the future that rivals what we've seen from Red Bull over the last few years, I think the Sergio Perez, Max Verstappen comparison that you make is a really fair one, because what if you put together a great car, a winning car, Fernando Alonso's getting the job done, and then you've got Lance Stroll finishing 10th, 11th, 12th out of the point sum, a few points here and there each weekend. And now you're in a constructors battle like we're seeing from Red Bull, because Sergio Perez hasn't held up his end of the bargain. Then I think when you're actually in the hunt, in the race, vying for championships, the decision becomes a little bit more apparent of what to do with that second seat.
Yeah. And I love conspiracy theory. I think I've thrown it out before. I think it's very conveniently timed that we've now got this situation where Alonso, every couple of weeks, we're like, oh, he's finished behind Stroll. I don't believe that, in a normal situation, you ever see that, because we saw what happened last year. It was night and days difference. So I think you're right. I think there's I wouldn't be confident going into a championship contending season if I had Alonso and Stroll there, because I think what you would have would be exactly that, Katie, would be the dynamic Red Bull they're dealing with, where you're trying to make excuses for a driver in the quickest or second quickest car finishing eighth every weekend. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I don't think there's a great sample size in Lance Stroll's favor to suggest otherwise. When the car's been great, he has not been great, traditionally speaking.
Right, just to
See,
be
that's
clear,
true.
you're saying that Fernando is throwing results to make Lance look better. Is
I'm
that
saying, yeah, if
because
you
that's quite a statement, and also I think that is where it becomes unfair on Lance, is that if he does make improvement, if he does get better, no one believes it because he's the boss's
yeah,
son, and so it kind of works the other way around. And I think you have to be careful not to fall
I'm not
into.
suggesting Fernando's throwing results, but I think there's situations where when he's now sixth behind Lance in fifth, he's happy to sit there. Or, he knows at the moment the team isn't scoring podiums. He knows for the sake of, Laurence, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes there. I just don't believe there's a world where, I mean, if you look at the results recently, how close it's been between them, I just don't believe it. Alonso's either he's got his head into next year,
I'd say it was
you
a
know,
conspiracy theory.
yeah, but my point is exactly the fact that if that Aston Martin was challenging with third position, Alonso, it's we saw, and the evidence is all of last season. Alonso was on a different planet to Stroll in that car. So, and you know how it is with drivers. Sometimes they're just, yeah, if the podium isn't there, if you're Fernando and you're driving for ninth again, it's like I can either be ninth, or if I nail this stint, I might leap past Lance in the pit stops and I'll finish eighth. I'm just not convinced he's putting it all on the line. I'm not saying he's throwing results by any stretch, because I think Fernando Alonso is great talent, and I don't think he would do that. But yeah, is he racing his heart out at the moment? I'm not convinced. But
This
maybe
could
I'm
be
wrong. I mean, if there's anyone who has got evidence to the contrary, please do share.
We could make the whole episode about this, but I do want to get to a couple other things because we've got some fresh comments from Toto Wolff on Lewis Hamilton's departure. I want to throw up this quote. Toto Wolff said he was recently asked if he has any regrets about Hamilton departing to go to Ferrari next season. And Toto said, no, we decided as a team for that. And we were always very transparent with Lewis. And the good thing with him is he is able to put himself in your position and understand where we were coming from. So in that respect, there are no bad feelings. There's no betrayal. It was also for the good of him to change. This was the longest run between a driver and a team. It was a 12-year run overall. And maybe he needed to, in a way, change and reinvent himself. Laz, let's start with you. Just what did you make of the comments? And do you feel like that is where the truth lies between the two?
Yeah, I think this is Toto has to kind of tell himself that there's no point in now being upset about Hamilton leaving, and certainly no point in bringing it into the press at this stage, right? He's got his two drivers for next year, Russell and Antonelli. He needs to convince everyone in the team that that's a positive way forward. They've said many times they can't replace Lewis Hamilton. Of course, it's impossible to replace a 7-time world champion with everything that goes with Lewis's ability. But I think this is a case of Toto, making sure that the agenda, certainly in the press, isn't we regret not keeping Lewis. But I don't think it certainly wasn't. I'm not. This isn't what Toto's saying, but you shouldn't get the impression that it was an agreement between Toto and Lewis that they would go their separate ways. Lewis made the decision to go to Ferrari because the contract that he had been offered from Mercedes was 1+1, and Lewis had made quite clear before signing that 1+1 contract that he wanted a longer term one, and obviously for whatever reason he wasn't given that. And then the ball was in Lewis's court. What do you do? Well, Lewis, took a look at Ferrari and decided that he wanted something different. He wanted a new challenge, everything that goes with that. And so he, called Mercedes bluff a bit and said, all right, I'm not doing the +1, and left. And Mercedes did not expect to be in this position. It's not like this was part of the long-term plan for Toto Wolff and Mercedes last year when they signed that deal with Lewis. They didn't expect him to walk after 1 year and then they have to fast track Kimi Antonelli into a Formula One seat for 2025. So, I think it's absolutely the right way for Mercedes to look at it. I don't think it was necessarily a betrayal. I think, that's wrong language as well. It was just the case that Lewis looked at the situation and wanted to take control of it himself a bit, I think. And the move to Ferrari is him exactly doing that. And it has this, all of the things that we talked about at the start of the year when Lewis made this decision, all of the appeal of Ferrari is there. But it's interesting watching Lewis over the Monza weekend, because you'd think it would be a time when he's looking at Ferrari in Italy, obviously the Ferrari win and all the great things around it. But he was actually quite reflective about it. He said, obviously he knew about the Antonelli news for some time, but when the news dropped on Saturday morning, it was still a bit strange for him waking up knowing that his seat had been filled for the following year. And, and then at the end of the weekend, he posted on Instagram an image of the engineering room and his room within the Mercedes motorhome, which two places he's now stepped in for the last time, unless he gets invited back in some kind of role or whatever. But the two places he stepped in for the last time, because now we go to the flyaway races, the engineering room that travels around Europe and the motorhome that travels around Europe won't be used again. So, yeah, I think Lewis is, reflecting on it as well. But I think both individuals, Toto and Lewis, because they are winners, essentially, they don't look back and they don't focus on the regret. They'll look back and they'll think fondly of the time they had together, as Toto's quote alludes to with the 12 years and all that kind of stuff. But equally, they have to change their mindset to what's coming next. And I think this is Toto doing exactly that.
Nate, I want to ask you about an article you have up on ESPN.com right now about the Las Vegas Grand Prix. Apparently, they're trying to make it an easier sell for the locals in Las Vegas coming up in November. What can you tell us about the efforts that they're trying to get rolling out there?
I think what Formula One's finding is that the second year, even though people say second and third year Formula One races are always among the toughest because you kind of lose that novelty factor, I think they're going to encounter that in a different way down the line. But from a logistics point of view, what they're finding is that everything they did last year is a bit easier. The locals understand a bit more what's going on. They've found quicker ways to do things. I think as well, they haven't had to repave all the roads like they did last year. It wasn't Formula One specifically doing that. It was I've completely forgotten the name of the commission. It's at Clark County in Vegas, I think it is. Who were doing that in conjunction with Formula One. Yeah, I could have said anything, and people wouldn't have known unless you're from Vegas. But they're finding that everything they did last year has either been accelerated or has just become a bit more second nature this season for this race. And there's a few other little things as well. There was a bridge over the Koval Strait last year. It was actually just right outside the hotel that Laurence and I stayed in. And that last year was a bit of a disaster. It was a bit of a bottleneck area for traffic. There was only 2 lanes, I think, of this bridge going over. This year, it's going to be long. It's going to be a wider bridge. Local businesses basically said all weekend no one could get down to to our bar or to whatever it was because they physically just couldn't get down there. So they're hoping that congestion is eased up. And yeah, we've spoken to a few people in Vegas, and I think that the feeling last year was that F1 actually got blamed for a lot of things in Vegas that weren't actually Formula One's fault. Somebody said, if there's a traffic cone out, it was like, oh, this is Formula One's fault. And it's like, well, there's always work going on in Vegas, right? It's not just Formula One. A lot of it was. I don't fully buy that that they weren't to blame for the majority of things going on there because there was so much upheaval needed. But yeah, and I think as well, there's a lot of quite big numbers have come out economically in terms of the benefits of the race. And I think Vegas, just generally speaking, and Katie, you can probably speak more to this living in the States, but it's becoming the destination for sports now, isn't it? And I think that the city itself is just really accepting the fact that this is just the way of it now. They've got all these franchises coming in. And I think that, yeah, the things they've done to establish Formula One in Vegas, that pit complex is now there all year round. I think they've had marketing all year about the race. So I think it just feels a bit more natural to people in Vegas now. I think there'll actually still be some controversy because it is going to be a race that causes a lot of disruption. I remember, I'm completely forgetting the name of the place, but I went with Dave, our producer, for some chicken over breakfast. And the waitress there was telling us, Dave, if Dave can jump on and remind me the name of the place, because I want to go back there again. The waitress was telling us what a nightmare it was for her because to get into town, Ubers were so much more expensive. And it was, so I don't think Formula One naturally can kind of really fix that. I think that's just going to be the way of things. But I think that on the top end, in terms of the negative headlines they were getting this time last year from local press, that's diminished slightly. But it's still a strange situation because you had one of the commissioners come out and say if they get year 2 wrong, there won't be a year 3, which is contractually is not correct. I mean, they've got a 10-year deal there. So that was a bit of a strange one. But I think Clark County are just holding them to account a bit better now and saying anything you're doing needs to be perfect. It needs to be signposted properly and it needs to be explained well. And Formula One has so much buy-in from the casinos there. And to be honest, the more I learn about Vegas, the more I'm understanding. If you have the buy-in of the casinos, you're basically okay. So yeah, I think that it'll be, I mean, being on the ground will be interesting. I think every single Uber driver I asked last year said they were not looking forward to it. It's anecdotal. It's not exactly a great poll, but from our side, when you spoke to people there, they weren't thrilled about the race. So I'm actually kind of curious to see how much that's changed, for year two.
You go out there regardless of whatever event's going on, Formula One aside, it's one of the most congested, smallest areas in the States because it's all on one strip. So there's an expectation that, yeah, when you're blocking off roads so that there can be a street race in Las Vegas, things are going to be disrupted to a very large degree. So hopefully, to your point, now that they've experienced it once, they know how to improve and make it a little bit more seamless. But it provided a great race. I mean, a year ago. So the hope is it does it again.
And should add as well, there's a support race this year, so the Ferrari Challenge will be there. And I think they're looking at whether they can have other series support it. Because I think that one of the issues last year that a lot of locals found was like, well, we've got all of this blockage up, and then they're coming out and they're doing, in the case of Vegas in year one, very, very limited Friday practice because that drain cover came loose. And they're like, well, why is all of this? There's nothing happening all day.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you follow Formula One, you're like, oh, no, but so how it works is you've got practice for an hour, a few hours break. But if you're a local in Vegas, you don't care about any of that. You're like, well, what is this all for? So I think they've made a point of making sure people can kind of see more stuff happening on track this year. The Ferrari Challenge is always a good fun one to watch. And I think it's quite Vegas centric as well. Like that's a nice sell for people there. So I think that'll make people a little happier. And it means that the track's actually been used before the race, which was a concern last year too.
Never underestimate an American's ability to not be in the know about something. What? This was happening this weekend? I didn't know that the roads were going to be closed. Like that's the epitome of Americans. So
there's a great old video, Katie, on social media. I forget the year, but it's a guy who's American, and I think he's on a tour of Asia, and this is kind of late 2000s, early 2010s, and he's got a great hotel in Singapore, and he's like, I've booked this really nice hotel. And look, when I open the door, and then you hear no, no, and he's like, "There's a Formula One race going on." He's like, "No one told me about it," And he's like really livid. And he's actually, if you actually look where he is, he's got one of the best views to watch any race ever.
And he's complaining.
Yeah, and I guess if you didn't know what was going on, you'd be a bit miffed about it. But it's just,
It's
exactly
a Google
to your point.
search.
Yeah. Why is my hotel room 3 times as expensive this weekend? That's weird.
Anyways, all right. So we go from one street race to the next. Laz, you are heading to Azerbaijan tonight for the Baku Grand Prix. It's the closest we've seen the constructors race at this point of the season. Obviously, we've been gifted with phenomenal racing over the last couple months at this point. McLaren's 10 points behind Red Bull at this point in the standings. Do you feel, Laz, that Baku will be able to provide McLaren with a first place?
Absolutely. It is the closest we've seen in terms of points, but in terms of the trajectories the teams are going, this is very much McLaren are doing to Red Bull what Red Bull were doing to the rest of the field at the start of the year. They're bossing it. So I right now it feels like the Constructors' Championship, if this continues, and there's no real indication that Red Bull are on top of the issues they're facing at the moment, certainly over the next few races, then the Constructors' Championship really is McLaren's to lose, despite being 10 points behind going into this weekend. So I think the eyes obviously are increasingly getting drawn to the Drivers' Championship, and that one's nowhere near as close because, points-wise, it's nowhere near as close, 62 points between Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. But also, Max, despite the issues that Red Bull have faced, has been able to grind results out of that car. Not so much in Monza. Sure, he really did start to struggle in Monza, but prior to that, the second in Zandvoort, for example, long way off Norris, but was still second. So, I think that's where everyone's eyes are going now is can Norris really mount a Drivers' Championship challenge? But we shouldn't ignore the fact that McLaren are looking like they're going to take the lead of this Constructors' Championship and win it, because they haven't won one since the late 90s, because the one they won in the late 2000s was taken away because of the Spygate scandal with taking documents from, or files from Ferrari and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a huge achievement for that team. Not only considering how long it's been since they last won a Constructors' Championship, but also just because where they were a couple of years ago, to be in the challenge for a title is massive. I don't want to make it sound like they've won it already, but seriously, on the trajectory at the moment, yeah, McLaren look like I said, theirs to lose rather than the other way around.
Do you think that we could get a Papaya Gate scandal based on team order? Like, I'm serious. I mean, they're 10 points out, right? So, like, every result at this point from both drivers has to be massive as we close out this season. Will we see, Nate, the continuous trend of letting the drivers kind of battle and continue on? Or do you think that they enforce team orders to ensure we see Lando finish ahead of Oscar?
I just hope they don't say higher racing rules again, because that was just such a cringeworthy phrase. I mean, that will be the dominant. I think in a way, McLaren are lucky that this Newey thing has kind of taken over for the last few days. It's kind of, diverted the news kind of cycle away from that. But yeah, Thursday, obviously, we'll speak to Lando. Well, I say we, Laurence and the journalists who are there. And we know they've spoken to the drivers both about it. And like we spoke about last week, I'm not convinced that both those drivers went into the race with the same understanding of what had been laid out. I don't think that McLaren gave them different instructions at all, but I think it was very vague. So I think at the very least, what we'll have is a much more clear understanding, a much more clear set of guidelines for those two guys. And to be honest with you, I would be stunned if we're in a situation where Piastri's ahead of Norris again, and especially if there's a threat from behind and we don't see a swap. Just because now I think that the way they've seen it play out, they saw it. I don't know. It's easy to armchair quarterback it, but I think that McLaren needlessly overthought that situation, and I think that the more simply they approach that, they might be better off. Because Laurence is right. I think at this point they should be quite comfortably, winning a lot of these races, and you don't want to be in a situation where you're putting your second driver on the racetrack behind another car just because you've you haven't played some team orders or something like that. So I think that's going to be the main talking point all weekend because they should be, whether you like it or not, Lando's the guy right now that's in with a better chance. So you've got to kind of and there's a long way back. You've got to kind of think about that in different situations. But yeah, Piastri last week, I think he made it pretty clear what he thinks about that idea. So I don't think it's as simple as we're making out either.
Fair. We alluded to this a couple of times already, but how much pressure falls on Sergio Perez this weekend to perform going into the race, Laz?
A lot, because part of the reason why I said this trend is going in that direction is Perez's lack of results. As I said before, Max is able to somehow grind out the results even when the car isn't where he wants it to be, but Perez isn't. Now, the only thing that the Italian Grand Prix showed us is that the situation at Red Bull in terms of getting that car nicely balanced is becoming so dire that actually Verstappen, who can pretty much drive anything, give him a bathtub, will stick it on, top 10 probably. But it's getting so bad that Verstappen is now complaining about the same things that Checo Perez was complaining about throughout the year. So part of that, I think, was down to the characteristics of Monza, the fact that they didn't bring a Monza package as it is, like a bespoke rear wing, and therefore, had to kind of balance the setup in slightly different ways. But I think it's getting to the point now where the only good thing for Perez is that he can point to Max and say, hey, look, it's not just me. It's not just me being a bad driver. Look, this is a fundamentally difficult car to drive. Max is now feeling it too. But of course, that's not a good thing for Red Bull as a whole. But as has been the case, and will continue to be the case for until the end of this season, Checo is under a lot of pressure because, if they don't win this Constructors Championship, and as I said before, my belief is that it's going to be very hard for them to do so, then you're going to look at it at the end of the year and you're probably going to point the finger at Checo as to where the points went missing. And that is going to weigh heavily on him. And if he's continuing to not even get close to podiums, rarely qualify in the top 4 or 5, then I think Red Bull will continue to assess his position going into next year and look at all their options. And that 2-year deal that he signed, probably isn't quite as strong as he thought it was when he signed it.
And also, let's not forget what Horner said over the summer break. When we thought maybe there's a chance they drop him, they pointed out there's a strong run of circuits coming up for him. And Baku was a circuit. I think it was his first win for Red Bull in 2021. Laurence is right. The car is kind of slipping away from both drivers, and I think the more you look at it now, the less likely it seemed in hindsight that Red Bull was ever really willing to make that decision over the summer to get rid of Perez. They let everybody believe the opposite was true. I think it was funny that they got kind of funny about the media suggesting that, because they'd been kind of they'd been kind of talking about that behind closed doors with us for a while. But one of the reasons when they said Perez is staying beyond the summer break, it was like, well, there's these great run of circuits coming up, and let's not forget at one point Sergio Perez was kind of unironically called the Street King in Formula One because he kept winning street races. So if there's ever a time for Perez to kind of refine that form, this is it, because it's two races where Red Bull could have a really big loss in the constructors. I mean, I'm the same as Laurence. There's two races coming up now before Austin. I think in Austin, McLaren are the constructors championship leaders, and Ferrari are pretty close as well. If you look a little bit further back, I think they're 30, 40 points back maybe. So it's not just second place that's in jeopardy. Ferrari, maybe they're not in the same kind of momentum swing as McLaren, but crazy that Red Bull's in that situation given how good they were at the start of the year, for sure.
How has Max handled it? Right? I mean, you go from being dominant to where you're almost falling asleep at the wheel, leading races by 30 plus seconds at some junctures. And now they're obviously struggling. Like, how has he been, I guess, through the last few months?
Yeah, I think he made
gaming a lot.
Yeah, well, perhaps as an escape, but I think he made his thoughts very clear in Austria. That was a race that he really should have won. There was the botched pit stop, and already there were signs that the car wasn't where it should be. And he made a few comments there about, perhaps people not realizing how bad this situation is going forward. And I think at that stage, he knew full well, like, the difficulty he was facing with the car, the fact that McLaren was making steady progress, and that there are these underlying balance issues when the car gets into a certain spot, and then also the issues they had at the start of the year. He wasn't particularly happy after Monaco, where they just couldn't be competitive because the car couldn't ride the bumps. So I think when it's been laid bare how difficult this car is to drive, and that it does have some very clear weaknesses, he's been very clear. And then the other thing, which I think he made a big thing of at the start of the year, although that was around a lot of politics going on at Red Bull, but is top level people leaving the team. And of course, since the start of this year, we've had Adrian Newey, and we now know he's going to Aston Martin. And then Jonathan Wheatley, the sporting director, is due to leave at the end of the year to go to be the team principal at Audi. There's also Rob Marshall, who, I don't think it's a coincidence that he left Red Bull, I think, last year to go to McLaren. The gardening leave always makes it a bit muddy in my mind as to exactly when they moved. But he would have taken a lot of, Red Bull's kind of the knowledge around what makes that Red Bull very quick. I don't think it's any coincidence that the McLaren is such a well-rounded, good car, and he's the kind of person who may have gone there with a number of those ideas or problem-solving methods taken with him. So I think Max he's been well to not really let loose. But if you read his post-race comments, especially when he's just out of the car and he's prone to saying what he thinks, he's been quite clear with his team that right now is not good enough. Because he'll also have an eye on 2025. We know he's staying at Red Bull for 2025 and 26, where the future is, although he's under contract, still actually quite open for Max into 2026.
With that, go ahead.
I was going to say, and he also said, didn't he, last time out, he's like, the prospect of losing both championships is very real as well, which we hadn't heard him say at any point. So to that point about the Drivers' Championship, even though it is quite a big gap, Max now clearly thinks, I mean, he's in damage limitation mode. So, that for me was a pretty telling comment that he made then.
Okay. With that, take that into your podium predictions. Okay. That's next. Current standings. Nate, you and I scored 0 points last time. Laz, you scored 1. Somehow we are still atop the rankings. I've got 16. Nate's got 14. Laz, you've got 12.
That's quite remarkable in itself. What was Laurence's point for? Was it for third place?
No, Charles Leclerc win.
Oh yeah. Okay, wow.
I predicted that. Yeah,
nice,
I went Leclerc, Norris, Sainz, I think.
What an emotional.
That's right, because at the end you were saying that Piastri was ruining your podium, right? Because he was second, and it would have been
There were a number of points during the race. During the weekend where Leclerc, Norris, and Sainz in the top 3. I was like, Nate, look, my prediction.
Yeah, he was. And I was like, I've made the wrong call here. I've made the wrong call.
I was proud to get the Ferrari. I thought that was a bold shout. Only gets me 1 point. Katie, I don't even know if you entered any
I didn't. And so
in
I
last week because you're so
I've
far ahead that you don't feel the need
fully
anymore.
logged on thinking I was going to be at the bottom, and here I am, basking in my glory for now. Okay, since you are on last, I will allow you to pick first, even though I wanted to pull rank and do it myself. But Laz, after you.
Well, I'm going to kind of draw the curtain back slightly here and say that I can already see Katie's predictions because she's put them on
Can you?
our live work
Here, well,
document.
you can pick that if you can pick that if that's what you think is going to happen.
I haven't
I was going to go for
seen.
something similar. I was going to go for something similar, but if I will be similar, I was actually going to go for exactly the same. It will be similar. So I will say in third place, Oscar Piastri.
Okay.
In second place, Lando Norris. And I'm going to go for back-to-back wins for Charles Leclerc.
Nice.
He's always quick in Azerbaijan. And so he's going to win the race. Again, I'm a bit like last week. I feel like I'm going out on a limb here, but hey, I've got to get some points
worked
back.
for you. It worked for you last time. Okay, I'm going to pull rank now and throw Nate to the wolves. So I'm going to go third place, Oscar Piastri. Second place, Charles Leclerc. First place, Lando Norris. So we just have flopped our top two. Nathaniel.
I am going to go for a second dose of Firegate because I think it's going to be third place, Charles Leclerc. Second place, Lando Norris. First place, Oscar Piastri. And I think that McLaren.
We've all picked the same three drivers, but just in different orders.
Yeah, because I'm not sure in that situation still McLaren feel confident enough to ask Piastri to move over, and I don't think he would because it's his second career win, and it is a tricky situation. And he's looked pretty good. If you look at Piastri lately, I think he's found something over the past kind of couple of weeks. So yeah, ballsy one.
No Mercedes, no Max Verstappen. What is the
we
world
used to just pick
coming
Max
to?
like routine every
know.
week. Now we're like, nah, not even putting him in there.
Pretty incredible. As always, thank you both for your time. Safe travels, Laz, to Baku. Enjoy it. We can't wait to see your analysis afterwards. And then we will be back next week to unpack it all on Unlapped. Thank you guys so much. Cheers, everybody.